Part 3. By the time of Hadrian, during the early 2nd century, the Romans had accumulated more than 180 holidays. Here is a typical Roman sacrificial ceremony. Originally religious in nature, by now they were primarily an excuse to hold some form of entertainment. Gladiatorial combats, wild animal hunts, horse races, moxie battles staged in an amphitheater such as this, and stage shows, complete with mimes, musicians, and dancers. The games involving men against beasts or other men served a distinct purpose. They helped to distract and channel the emotions of the frustrated Roman citizen who had less and less to do with his government. As the empire and the authority of the emperor grew, Emperor Hadrian, however, chose not to use the authority to make further territorial conquests. Instead, he concentrated on Greek philosophy and other studies. He much preferred to have himself portrayed as an allegorical figure in the manner of a Greek hero than the leader of his troops. Here we see him as sacrifice to all. Other examples of Hadrian's love of all things Greek are the many Greek ideas he borrowed to his palace at Italy. These caryatids which flanked the pool are an adaptation of those on the Erechtheim in Athens. Hadrian also built the Temple of Venus in Rome, the only temple in Rome which had symmetrical ground plan and freestanding colonnade of the classical Greek temple. Copies of famous Greek statues, such as these two of the Doryphons, multiplied rapidly during Hadrian's regime, as did portraits of Hadrian and his followers in the guise of Greek gods. Note that this is the first Roman emperor to appear in beard, a fashion copied from the ancient Greeks. But despite Hadrian's passion for ancient Greece, the building for which he is most famous had little in common with anything which had gone before him, let alone a Greek temple. The Pantheon, whose spectacular dome equals half its height, was and unique. It represents a brilliant melding of the classical column with the Roman vault. This elaborate interior makes the Pantheon a perfect antithesis to the Greek temple, whose columns are sculpture decorated the exterior, while the interior was relatively simple. With the Roman love of thick, concrete walls, the Pantheon is plain, not to say ugly, on the outside, yet hardly articulate and theatrical within. The spectacular visually stands inside a piece of geometric sculpture. Art during the reign of Antoninus and Marcus Aurelius, who followed Hadrian, continued in a Greek-inspired vein, perhaps more deeply modeled and naturalistic than comparable Greek works, but essentially classical in feeling. One of the few pieces of sculpture in the round to survive, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius conveys a monumental, larger-than life-size feeling. More importantly, it marks the close of an age. The classical realism and naturalism of the first 2 centuries of the empire came to an abrupt halt in AD 180 under the rule of Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, inheriting none of his father's administrative genius and sense of justice. Commodus was a dissident, tyrannical ruler. His only positive contribution was the completion of the memorial column planned by Marcus Aurelius. A brief comparison of Aurelius' column was with that of Trajan, completed 70 years before, immediately demonstrates the new abstract expressionistic style known as late antique. Note how simplified the scene from Aurelius' column is compared with the elaborate detail in Trajan's frieze. While the carving on Trajan's column was quite flat, The modeling of Arolesus column seen here is now deeply cut and drilled, creating an exciting, raw-hewn, and merciless picture of war. No longer in the emperor seen in profile addressing his men in a fully detailed setting as is seen here on the column of Trajan. Instead, each scene of Arulus's column is abstract and schematized with the emperor turned more toward the spectator. Human pity for the vanquished barbarians, which was evident in Trajan's column, is strikingly absent here. Now the bodies of the barbarians are twisted in angular, distorted wreaths. The style is sketchy and the figures leap out at the spectator. After Commodus for almost the whole 3rd century, the empire was ruled by a series of soldier emperors. The empire had grown too unwieldy to be run in peace from Rome, and as chaotic conditions increased, artistic style grew more and more sketchy and confused, as essential details were omitted. This is evident even in the badly damaged reliefs from the Ark of Septimus Severus, the first of the soldier emperors and the first emperor who didn't gain power through blood relation on the express wish on his predecessor. Instead, Severus was catapulted into power by his army, setting a precedent that resulted in 19 changes of government in the next 72 years. Here are some of the men who briefly reigned. Notice the current troubled expressions on their faces. During the 3rd century, the tide of Roman conquest also turned. No longer were the Romans the aggressors. Here you see the Roman prisoner in the hand of a barbarian tribe. They now had to defend Italy against the barbarians who were drawn by the wealth and grandeur of the empire. Here the barbarians set an angry lion against the Roman defenders. The soldier emperors, afraid to leave Rome for fear they would be outset, rarely accompanied their armies. Thus, even victories were uninspired events, and the historical narrative relief, so characteristic of Roman artistic achievement for 200 years, died out with the Arch of Septimus Severus. The historical narrative was revived for the last time in the Arch of Constantine, more than 100 years later, with his dream of returning to the peaceful era of Augustus, which led him to shave off his beard in favor of Augustus' youthful look. Constantine represented the only person with sufficient force of personality to pull the empire together for a final burst of glory. In the late antique abstract style of art, we see his army's victory at the Milvian Bridge, a victory which gave Constantine total power over the Roman Empire. When 15 years later he moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, he signed the death warrant for Rome as the hub of civilization, a position it had uh, occupied for 500 years. It is therefore appropriate that the Arch of Constantine, besides reviewing all the historical narrative, relief as seen here also has physically borrowed sections from historical reliefs of the past, namely from the time of Trajan in the frieze on the inside wall of the ark, from the time of Hadrian in the circular medallions, and from the era of Marcus Aurelius in the panels from Attic Story. How dramatically these reliefs from former eras point up the clumsy abstract style which marked the end of Roman art. Perhaps when Constantine decided to borrow from the past, he foresaw that his memorial arc would be the last one Roman soil, and thus he purposely intended it to be a perfect summary of the best of Roman art.